Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us here today. And welcome to the second day of the Decolonizing Economic Summit. This is our third post-capitalism conference, our third annual post-capitalism conference. And so I wanted to speak for a couple of minutes about the conference, just give it a little bit of framing, and then I'm going to pass it over to David, who's going to introduce more specifically the panel that y'all are here to attend. Just in regard to where we are in the conference planning and the involvement, I wanted to share a little bit about how things have evolved over the last 3 years. As you all have noticed, we have very intentionally included Decolonizing Economics, the third post-capitalism conference. And so that came out of the collaboration. As you've probably seen from the materials, this event is co-anchored by the Wiyot Tribe, Cooperation Humboldt, and specific faculty members and departments at Cal Poly Humboldt. And while the nature of post-capitalism is a key theme that we're here to explore, it was through this collaboration that we really wanted to push further the notion of decolonizing economics. And this is also significant because of the increasing involvement of the Wiyot Tribe in this conference. David Cobb, one of our key core organizers here, actually went in front of the tribal council and asked the tribe to sign on as a co-anchor of this event. And it's just really incredible that the council voted unanimously to support this conference and to sign on as co-anchors. And you've seen participation from day one throughout this conference and just helping us to push further on what we want in regards to a post-capitalism conversation, but going beyond that to think about how we actually are thinking about a lot of other aspects regarding our social and environmental justice that are uniquely tied to approach of decolonizing economics. So we're so grateful to be able to convene this event. It's grown tremendously over the last 2 years, 3 years. But just in comparison from last year to this year, we had just shy of 500 participants last year, and now we are over 1,000 registrants at this event, which just shows that people are so eager for this conversation. They're looking for it. And so without further ado, I want to pass it over to David Cobb to introduce our panel so that we can hear more about this conversation that we're all here to join today. Thank you.
Hawat my name is David. I use he, him pronouns. I'm coming at you from Jarajiji, also known as Eureka, California, on the unceded land of the Wiyot people. And as Nicola has just shared, the notion of decolonizing economics is coming out of a deep, authentic political relationship between the Wiyot tribe, the work that we're doing together. And it is my great honor to be both part of the People's Network of Land and Liberation, but really to be introducing and framing this panel as the moderator. We've got three key folk who are part of the People's Network for Land and Liberation. I'm going to just say a word or two about them and then invite each of them to answer a prompt question, which I'm going to tell them right up front. And that prompt question is, why are you spending your precious time as part of another political formation known as the People's Network for Land and Liberation, right? So why is it that you feel like that's worth the investment? Why are you doing it? And for me, I'll answer the question myself, because to me, if we're not actually rooted in the land, in the productive capacity of the land in a genuinely sustainable way, we're actually not serious revolutionaries, or I'm not a serious revolutionary. So I honestly believe the People's Network for Land and Liberation is the most inspirational and the most concrete way to imagine a national movement that I can connect the work that I'm doing here in Humboldt. So with that, the panelists will be Kali Akuno, co-founder of Cooperation Jackson, co-founder of the People's Network for Land and Liberation, and one of the most brilliant theorists and revolutionary practitioners that I know. We'll also be joined by Michelle Edelman McCormick, who is active in the creation of Cooperation Vermont and one of the co-anchors of an evolving the Marshfield village store converting into a cooperative. And then lastly, somebody who's fast becoming a dear friend of mine, Kamal Franklin, who has a long and storied history. You can see all of their bios on the website. But the thing that I want to lift up is that Kamal is not only a lawyer by training and has been involved in multiple social change organizations, but the work that they're doing at Community Movement Builders in Atlanta, explicitly identified as work to create an explicit liberated zone, has got me nothing short of excited to be working with him. So with that, I'm going to go in that same order. Kali, Michelle, Kamal, to answer the question, why is it that you are investing time and energy in creating something known as the People's Network for Land and Liberation? And I guess I'll ask Kali, tell us in each of you say in your words what you think PNLL is and why you're doing it. Kali.
All right. Well, good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever folks may be. Kali Akuno with Cooperation Jackson. He, him, anything said with love and respect. Speaking to you from Megan Eversville, as I was mentioning to folks the other day, we're about to rush headlong into, and we're going to have to change our name eventually, realizing that, but we're about to rush kind of headlong into a campaign to get rid of this damn Andrew Jackson statue in his name over the city and just stir up some stuff. So be on the lookout for that. But we are in Choctaw territory, unceded Choctaw territory, and what a few of us call the New African National Territory, one of the homes of the New African National Territory. So, all right, but to get into this question, first, I guess maybe it'd be helpful to give folks a little bit of background. And this conversation around the People's Network for Land and Liberation started almost 2 years ago. In its present form, let me put it that way, actually. There are other iterations and prior kind of things that bleed into it, which are longer, but you know, it was in the middle of the pandemic, and it arose because I think, you know, it was time for to arise, right? That we needed something, I think, at this stage in the particular the cooperative and solidarity economy movement that started actually linking various nodes that were engaged in similar practices around, you know, land acquisition, land demodification, land decolonization, kind of municipalist level political engagement around political power, and then the development of the solidarity economy, co-ops, and all the other institutions that support that. And if you look at all the organizations that are part of PNLL, we are all engaged in those set of practices, those combined set of practices, you know, which is a bit unique in the social movement landscape within the United States right now. We hope it's not unique for long, right? That more folks get involved in this kind of cluster of things, or their forces combined that are doing this in different cities, because some elements of all these are being done almost everywhere, but not necessarily folks doing them within kind of like one organization or one combined space. So the groups that were kind of part of the initial conversation were all engaged in those, but not just in those as like practices in and of themselves, but in those because we were trying to move a revolutionary agenda. Like that is a particular piece that I think it makes it even much more explicit. Now, when I say a revolutionary agenda, I want everybody to be clear. It's not one that like we are all one kind of united party, you know, marching in lockstep behind one line. That's not actually what we're talking about, right? We're talking about a variance, right? I wouldn't even call it multi-tenants, but a variance of political experiences that are leaning, you know, towards the building not only an anti-capitalist world, but I would argue for, in general terms, eco-socialist world where we dismantle all the different kind of oppressive institutions, starting with the deconstructing and dismantling the United States government itself, right? So those are some commonalities that we had, and we're trying to move forward and do joint study, joint planning, and I think the critical piece why I said it's needed, joint production with each other, right? To build supply chains and value chains to move us the next step forward. I think in the construction of, as I put it, kind of the construction of eco-socialism from below. So that's why it's, this is why I know me and Cooperation Jackson, some of the summation of why we are here and what we're trying to aim. And we're very clear, like this is all aspirational, right? There's some pieces of this that all of us are doing. There's some pieces of this that we got a long, long way to go to get on a local level, let alone kind of a national level to where we want to be. But to be in dialogue and with each other and develop, the communication, the democratic practices, the habits, struggling through major challenges, political issues. This is the core piece of what we know it takes to kind of move this forward in a planned and deliberate way. So that's why I'm here. And hopefully, those of you who are listening, raise some more questions about that and start thinking about how you might be involved in something like this, if it sounds appealing. So I'll stop there and then we can go, I think it was to Michelle next, right?
Sure. My name is Michelle Edelman McCormick, she, her pronouns, and I am based in Marshfield, Vermont, which is unceded territory for the Abenaki. And I wear, I think David alluded to a whole bunch of hats, in addition to being one of the board members for the very newly formed Cooperation Vermont, and then our flagship program, which has been the acquisition of the Marshfield Village store, which is more than just a store and a general store within the community. It's a very much a hub for this area for like the comings and goings of all things in this very small rural town. And then converting it to a worker-owned cooperative. But then I'm also the coordinator for a collaborative effort called Regeneration Corps, which is working within schools across Vermont, providing hands-on training to students, mostly in high school, but also now branching into middle schools on regenerative agriculture, climate change, resiliency, and applying like local strategies for that, and the cross sections for racial and social justice. So that's doing a lot, right? And my interests, in the People's Network for Land and Liberation are in so much as that Cooperation Vermont was created in many respects as an extension, of that process, and the need to have, similarly organized, activities and formations in this particular region. It's a bit where I would say the, overall movement, regionally, nationally towards economic democracy and how do we evolve in a post-capitalist, economy and society meets the realities of climate change and what that's going to mean most likely for the next generation, in where what parts of our country are going to potentially be more resilient than others, and where quite simply food is going to be able to continue to be produced and those kinds of things. And so rooting the work within this region of New England to the People's Network for Land and Liberation as part of this national network and that piece of it. Does that make sense? Kali, do you want to, what did I miss? That was good? Okay, cool. And I guess I'll go ahead and pass to Kamal.
Hey, everybody. Thank you for that, Michelle. Thanks everybody for having me to be part of the conversation. Quickly, my name is Kamal Franklin. I'm a part of Community Movement Builders, grassroots organization, centrally located in Atlanta, particularly in Southwest Atlanta, one of the last poor and working class Black communities that is semi-intact in Atlanta. Part of our struggle down here is to fight against the gentrification that's taking place, particularly in urban areas, and to fight against police brutality and police intrusion within our communities. On the other side of that, we also do what we call sustainable development, which is working around building cooperatives, helping people stay in their homes by providing a sustainability fund, and also doing mutual aid work in terms of providing food and toiletries and having people work with us towards that end. And our major goal is, as David mentioned, is to try to create as much as possible what we call liberated territory. And that's basically creating an area that we as a people control, that we control as institutions, that we challenge state and city institutions, which have domain and power over our communities. And that fit in perfectly for why we joined the network. Because for us, the network was, as it was burgeoning and as described, explicitly anti-capitalist, explicitly socialist in nature, and explicitly trying to challenge the state. So even as we talk about what is post-capitalism, right? We know we won't get to post-capitalism until we challenge capitalism, right? Capitalism won't just fall apart, right? It's not going to just fall at our knees and say we give up. Capitalism is going to struggle, fight, do its dirty tricks to remain in control and to maneuver. So part of what organizations like ours needed to do was to team up nationally and in some places, in some ways internationally, with fellow organizers, fellow travelers, fellow radicals to say, this is what we want to build in terms of what we need as we continue to fight capitalism, right? So that that build and destroy or build and fight back idea that we won't be able to motivate and energize people until we're also able to develop what a base of operations kind of looks like, right? What can people dream of in terms of what a post-capitalist or anti-capitalist economic system starts to look like? What do people see in terms of sharing resources, in terms of having decision-making over how economic institutions decide to give out wealth or to share wealth or to distribute wealth? What do some of those models begin to look like? And I think one of the interesting things about the group that we've collected or gathered together in terms of working on the network is that people are steep in those ideas around creating structures that are not hierarchical in nature. Again, structures that think about what the disbursement of resources looks like, particularly amongst people who are working and making the things happen in terms of production. And that's important because people need to see that and hear that in order to get excited about what the alternatives can be. And that's one of the main reasons why we decided that we wanted to be a part of the network. And again, in addition to that, I think it's extremely important to continue stressing that these folks are fighters. These people are folks who've been down with struggles, some of which for many decades, to fight against the exploitation of capitalist markets, of corporations, of the police, of governing institutions which control our community. And we won't get to post-capitalism, right, until we figure out ways in which we create national movements which are steeped in people organizing in their communities. And so that was something that was extremely exciting to be a part, sort of another band of rebels, and talking through what the ideas of what the movement should look like and what the movement should be. And so for us, it was just really important and really sort of a straightforward gesture to say that, yes, we wanted to be a part of this network. We wanted to struggle with this network. We wanted to be a part of this team of people who are working through what all of that can look like, and what it looks like to share resources. And as Kali mentioned, to build the different types of institutions that help build upon the work that we're each doing in our various cities. So that, in a nutshell, is why I joined the network, or why our organization joined the network, and why we're pleased to be here, even in terms of this call and this meeting, so that we can further have that discussion and further broaden out the network and other networks that are happening at the same time.
Thank you so much, Kamal, and all of you, Kali and Michelle. I'm going to actually now bring us all together. I think I can make the technology work. Look at here. So I thought what we would do now is literally have a conversation with one another based on what we just heard. And there was a lot there. I'm going to turn to something that Michelle said to really lift up and ask the question, both to the panelists and those of you who are watching us in this fishbowl style. Was Michelle being hyperbolic when she talked about where food can maybe go? Like that was a very profound and provocative statement. So I'll turn it to you first, Kamal. Like when you heard that, did you flinch? Did you feel like she's being over the top? Like what time is it in terms of the ecological collapse?
Yeah, I don't think she's being hyperbolic at all. So even as we, even as I stated, that capitalism just won't surrender. Even as capitalism is eating resources, destroying the planet, literally killing people, all of these other things are happening at the same time because of the capitalist market, which is never satisfied, which is always looking for more exploitation. And so the signs of planetary collapse, even when it's right in front of them, does nothing to slow them down because they're far more interested, again, in reaping profits from what they can get out of the exploitation of resources, people, and land. So I definitely think, and when we look particularly at what's happening in the United States, I think we're still within I would say a 20 or 30 year period, a historical period, where this country is starting to come apart at its seams. And a lot of that has to do, obviously, with the capitalist exploitation, the white supremacy, which is endemic to the country, and how the white working class is seen is in their own mind, right, whether they are accurate or not, but thinking that they are somehow being replaced, or because of the demographic shifts, that somehow they are in trouble in terms of what they see as their place in America. I think elites are exploiting that. I think too many of the white working class in particular decide to side with those elites because it's the old formation of, I may be poor, but at least I'm not Black, right? And where is my place in America if at least I'm not Black? But I think that kind of anger and racism and white supremacy is literally being seen and again being stoked by right-wing politicians and liberal Democrats in different ways as they try to hold together what they see is an America in which Black people in particular are the appendages of the Democratic Party and not seeking its own self-determination or right to its own resources or control over land and spaces. And so I think all of these things are coming to a continual head, which I think we're in the presence of seeing and organizing in and living through. But I definitely think that these things are happening now. And if we don't begin to figure out ways in which our communities begin to feed themselves, clothe themselves, house themselves in the simplest terms, what we're looking at is continually being at the whim of a long-term track, long-term in 20, 30 years, but a dying empire. And when that will fight, kill, scratch, and do whatever it has to do to survive, but it doesn't mind having people die while that's happening.
Kali?
Yeah, we've already driven over the cliff in many respects. The question is, how's the landing going to be and at whose expense, basically? If you just look at kind of, I guess, the largest, case study that they're talking about, which is this inter-imperialist rivalry in Ukraine. One of the things that they don't hype up enough or educate people enough is about how central Russia and Ukraine are to world food supplies, right? Particularly a couple of key products, wheat, forms of millet and other stuff in particular being central amongst that. And that there's already massive food shortages in parts of Asia, already starting to occur in parts of Africa. And this is on top of a major particularly in East Africa and Madagascar, where there's been some elements of starvation over the past couple of years because of a serious drought. That reality is already here for many. We are just, for the time being, somewhat shielded by it from being, in the heart of Babylon, as many of us say. And unlike previous kind of civilizations, if you want to call this one, where when folks kind of tapped out their environments, which has happened before, because they just kind of sucked too much out of their immediate bioregion, those collapses appeared to be sudden, right? And then over a couple of centuries or millennia, those eras rebound and regroup. Well, this empire is global, so it's stealing from every place, and it can then kind of, at least in this core metropoles, hide and shield it away, the thievery which is going on to ensure kind of a stable food supply, in the United States, in Canada, in Western Europe, in Australia, and a few other kind of places like that. But rest assured, all that's coming here. And this, inflation crisis is just kind of the tip of the iceberg of that. The massive inflation really, that's going to hurt poor and working class people severely, and it shows no signs really of abating, no matter what they little tricks of quantitative easing or X, Y, and Z that they're trying to do, or trying to curb the price of gas with this, letting more loose from the strategic oil reserve. Because in many respects, this is some of the mechanisms of this particular crisis, I think, are new because of how the global economy has shifted. And then we also see very clearly that there's massive problems with the supply lines on a global scale. So these are not going to get any better. In fact, they're going to get, profoundly worse. And they're getting so, more so by the day. So one of the, I'll leave folks with why I'm saying, take this to be real. There's a pretty significant bird flu, which is spreading throughout the United States right now, right? And to where I think one of the last reports I heard from yesterday, I think they've culled at least 500 million chickens, throughout most of the Midwest, and that's now moving down here to Mississippi. So the price of chicken, which is one of the most stable forms of meat consumption in the United States and cheapest, like that's about to rise significantly on the backs of the inflation, and there's no particular end in sight. And remember, this is occurring in the midst of an ongoing pandemic that many people are just acting like it's over. Well, coronavirus and the bird flu, they're not too far away from each other in terms of being cousins. And I think one of the things that I've been, fearing deeply is how much the right has gained kind of social and political ground during this pandemic, when they clearly should have gotten their asses handed to them. There really should have been a serious movement in this country, in this empire, around universal health care. But instead, we going in the reverse, where healthcare is being eliminated for folks in some half the population's right to certain types of healthcare, women in particular, and people who can give birth. That's being specifically targeted. That's not just where they're going to stop. But I'm bringing this all up to state is that because of the industrial nature of capitalism, these pandemics are going to be a current frequency from here on out. They actually have been the last 20 years, but again, that's something that's been kind of somewhat localized to Africa and Asia, mainly China. But it's global now. And sooner or later, one of these is going to pop off. That's going to make COVID-19 look like a joke. And this society and most societies are not going to be ready, right? And so I'm adding this in. It's not just a food crisis. There's a deeper ecological crisis that's going to have a whole bunch of impacts, and this is just one. And the food and ecological crisis, the health crisis, these things are all interlinked. And so we need to be thinking strategically about how and where do we fit into this, because one of the things that We haven't gotten to this level of food sovereignty by any stretch of the imagination here in Jackson. But one of the things we learned off of Katrina was like, look, we better get in a position where we can provide in our communities, get back to we can do some major caloric intake of our own for when the state or when capital decides, they're not going to feed our poor Black and brown asses anymore.
Well, that's real talk. I'm going to pick up on this. So I feel like the four of us, and I reckon most of the folks, at least at this particular conference, are actually in agreement that we are in systems collapse, right? And I really want to name it, y'all. Like, I've spent my entire adult life as a social change agent trying to transform, society writ large. And the metaphor for me is, I knew I was on the Titanic, right? And there's an iceberg, and I was in the steering, like I was at the hulls of the ship, right? But I was doing everything I could to try to get, like, either myself or somebody else up to that helm, right? And try to avoid the iceberg. Like, we can transition, we can shift. But I've just acknowledged, like, and each of you said it, we've hit that fucking iceberg, y'all. It's too late. Our window to actually truly transition is gone. So the stage that we're coming to here is, all right, how do we build as many lifeboats as possible? And I think that what unite the four of us is around these lifeboats. And Michelle, you kicked us off, right? So everybody's in agreement with you. Tell us a little bit about how you're seeing your lifeboats, and we'll start with you, Michelle.
Yeah, so Vermont is my lifeboat, right? I'm a recent, transplant to somebody locally called me, a climate change migrant. Actually, I came up here in 2020 during the height of COVID. From Naples, Florida, which is in Collier County. It's very southwest Florida, all the way at the southern tip on the Gulf Coast. And, is having all the issues of environmental degradation. The water pollution is really out of control. I mean, massive amounts of sea life just washing up on shore because of the red tides and the blue-green algae blooms. There are neurotoxins and the whole thing. And at the same time, all of this is kind of, happening. And even though my family has been, in that area since the 50s, when it was just a small fishing village, kind of a town, it was also around the time of the Floyd rebellion. And I was in this moment in space with my two children where it's like I'm sitting in what I know is just on the brink of environmental collapse, and my children are not going to be able to be another generation here. Like, this is not going to be a thing. And I've got daily flyovers of my house from the Collier County Sheriff's Office saying hello because of my incessant commentary about their helicopter budget. So they would just come by and say hello, and literally having Proud Boys like stalking me and my family, as we're driving around in the car and taking pictures of us. And so, I'm looking at environmental collapse, and I'm looking at an unsustainable future for my children. And I'm looking at just dead ass right here in my face, the absolute rise of real fascism in our country. Like, people always talk about, fascist, government under Trump and all of those things. And I've always said, like, we didn't wake up one day in 2016 to a fascist country, right? We brought a fascist country into that election and gave it a mascot, right? And so we're just really getting more and more deeply rooted in the inevitability. I think it's just an inevitability at this point that those forces are going to continue to gain strength, and we just have to actually start getting fucking serious about what we're going to do on the community level to combat it, right? To fortify ourselves, to be able to provide for ourselves, our communities. And I don't know if anybody has a link, maybe David or somebody, to an article that Kali recently put out talking about this 10-mile radius strategy, right? And if we could somewhere find that and, you know, put that out with this recording, I think that that would be great. You know, one thing that occurred to me as I was listening to Kamau and Kali talk was just reflecting on the insight that, you know, Kali and I in particular have after doing organizing work post-Katrina in New Orleans. That's where we know each other from, and really having like an acute insight into what it looks like when the government is just not only nowhere to be found, but where they are to be found are actively organizing against the community and in really oppressive and suppressive ways. And what that, you know, that post-apocalyptic, you know, kind of future that we keep talking about in I don't know, a broad sense when we talk about climate change realities, like we've seen that in its like microcosm of what that looks like. And one of the biggest takeaways, you know, from me in that experience was the absolute necessity for local communities to be like really organizing amongst themselves for self-sustainability. And I've gone on too long. I'm going to shut up.
Not at all. Not at all. Kamau?
Well, I'll pick up on that point about organizing, because the lifeboat for me is organizing. And, you know, again, even as we struggle around or talk about either autonomous land, liberated zones, decolonizing spaces, as we all know, capitalism is not a local phenomenon, right? It's not a national phenomenon, it's an international phenomenon. So for me, it's always about how are we organizing people to combat it? What are the systems we're creating? What are the structures we're creating to combat capitalism? And again, starting local, going national, and going international. You know, one of the things that we've done at Community Movement Builders is that we've linked up with socialist organizations in Haiti, and we've actually given resources to help them build let's call it a community center that's built around sustainability work, right? That's built around the same things that we're doing here in Atlanta, whether or not it's finding or controlling food sources, organizing the local population, struggling against the capitalist domination of their government. You know, we're just writ large. We're just in another area, but fighting the same beast that's all connected through international mechanisms and means, and that's obviously dominated by Western Europe and the United States. But we have to understand that there's no safe havens, right, in that respect. So even if we create some enclaves in which we control, we understand that the fight is still a forward fight, because again, capitalism, those who run it, those who seek benefit from it, don't see the world in the same way that we do. They see us as the expendables in this fight for control or climate disaster and so forth. They see us as the people who will continually churn out whatever goods they may need to survive, who will continually do the work to build the spaceships that they so desire to go explore other places, to build their underground bunkers, to build their military hardware, which allows them to compete with other international actors and fight these international wars on who gets to control the larger global economy, right? So I think all of that is taking place, we still, in my estimation, have to begin to organize and build larger structures and larger sort of people power structures that allow us to fight back and to battle back, to convince people of the things that we see. And that, you know, this entertainment culture, this culture of delusion that we are caught up all in, that, you know, the Will Smith fight is worth far more time and energy and brain power than the fight to get sustainable food within our community, right? Those things, the capitalist structures will continue to throw those distractional things at us. We have to organize people to fight back and to create the structures as we go. So for me, the lifeboat has always been and will always be, what do we do to organize our folks, our peoples, so that we can fight back against capitalism as we prepare and struggle around what post-capitalist societies may look like.
Tully, I'm going to invite you to talk a little bit about the vision of confederating some of these lifeboats, right? Like, because you've really been at the, I mean, you've been at the tip of the spear thinking about this, at least in my world. So I'd invite you to share your thoughts on that.
Several layers of that. One there is about the refuge that we've been talking about. Like, where can we identify places that may be able to sustain themselves on at least an ecological, basis, where there's going to be enough water, access to arable land, and then access to the community that we could work with, right? To build some living systems there. And this is some anticipation of there being, within a very short time, some level of climate migration, taking place within the United States. Now, some level of it is already taking place. There are folks who happen to be moved off of some of the coastlines in Louisiana, parts of Alaska, parts of, I think, North Carolina, some other places. So that is actually already happening within the United States. But for us, I think we want to be, systemic and deliberate and intentional about building the relationships that we need, and doing the kind of transition work and the planning work, the economic and political planning work of supplying each other to be able to meet each other's needs, kind of across these regions and across these zones, but to do so in a way that builds each space up politically, like in its own home base, to be able to engage in some sustained fights, on the local level, because that's going to have to happen in a couple of critical ways. And one of the things that we need to kind of very explicitly start thinking deeper about how do we build our own urban to rural and rural to urban kind of connecting strategies, right? That is a piece that the left, in broad terms, in many respects, I think, has jettisoned a long time ago, right? And a lot of our thinking has been very much focused and centered in on kind of urban populations and urban kind of settings and urban dynamics. And that's been in many sense focused around having to adapt to the industrial world, which was, forcibly imposed upon most of us. Particularly most of our folks moved out of the rural areas, in the 19th and 20th century, particularly Black folks in the 20th century in particular, moved out of those areas. But with that, we left, some key knowledge around how production actually really work and what's its foundation. And the real foundations of it, at least we forget, are agriculture. And then the other part of that is the reproductive work, like those two things, like who's producing the food, who's cooking the food, to enable the quote unquote industrial workers, to do what they do. And that kind of piece, I think, has been jettisoned. So part of our thinking is rebuilding and intentionally reconnecting those links to make sure that we have the kind of supply chains and the lifelines that we're going to need to our communities, and being very clear and specific around how do we not only create these liberated zones, but how are they connected with each other, right? Because the other key component of that is we're going to have to think about the how do we secure these areas, right? Because one of the big things that we know we will have a problem here in Jackson is that outside of the Kush, which is the Mississippi Delta, that in that region, we are fundamentally surrounded by some pretty hostile forces who take pride in the pain that they have inflicted upon our people historically, right? they frame it as their heritage and things of that nature. But, its animus is very much directed against us and indigenous people. So we have to be, I think, intentional about how do we build these things where we can kind of secure them, and then all the different pieces that are going to be needed within there. So there's effective internal communication that can happen. There's like decentralized but democratic planning that goes on to make sure we kind of meet our needs in a fundamental way. And I think what we've laid out at this stage of kind of who is in PNLL, it spans a broad region, but then there's a critical map within the empire that we're going to have to fill in, because if you look at it right now, we're too disconnected and too kind of far away and too isolated, I think, to make the critical shift. And we knew that going in, but it's like, how do we fill in some things, and then how do we do the work to build the links and build the connections with folks around the political clarity that's going to be needed to engage in this type of work, right? Because it's not about enriching oneself, it's about a long-term plan of not only, first there's the element of survival, but then there's like, how do we come out of this? And we want our children and grandchildren to come out on the other end, right? Because we're just setting up the foundations. The beneficiaries of this will be another generation, and we need to be clear around that. And that's a political commitment that we need to be clear that we are making in terms of doing this work, because it's going to entail a certain amount of sacrifice to do this work and to do it effectively.
So I just wanted to, piggyback on what both Kamal and Kali have pointed out about the absolute need for, our local organizing to be connected to other local organizing projects in proximity, and then to statewide and national, being connected as much as possible is going to be critical, because, like, let's be real, any one of us, they will pick off like a tick, right? And the only, real hope for being able to navigate the changing political and environmental landscapes for any of our, particular areas geographically is to be connected and to recreate our own, production and supply chain, and be able to, have fallback security options and, all of these things that, yes, it's so important that even though we have a tendency sometimes to either always be thinking very broadly and be thinking, high theory and, thinking on the global landscape of things and not able to operationalize things locally, or it's very easy to get fixated on what we're doing within our own like pocket of a community that we get so busy with that it's hard to look up sometimes. We just have to prioritize both to the best of our ability, or they will, like I said, pick us off like a tick.
Thank you, Michelle. I'm going to actually stick with you for a minute, because I want to, like, as a white-skinned person, right, ask you, because Kamal has said something about the white working class, and, those are, quote, my people, right? Like, I got cousins who are going to break either fascist or eco-socialist, right? So first of all, I want to just ask, like, are you seeing the same thing that Kamal has described about the white working class and how I used to say, I only have one enemy, and that's my class enemy. But I literally had to change that, because what I realized is, damn, members of my own class are breaking with the fascists. And maybe I'm naive, y'all, but I did not predict that. I literally thought that whenever it came down to it, that they were going to actually, like, that we were going to see more Bacon's Rebellion, right? I see y'all smirking at me, right? Like, how naive I was. But, like, I guess give me either some hope or completely shed my delusion. Like, is there still space for the white working class? Can we still carve out sections to break with us as this crisis hits? What are you seeing there in rural Vermont?
So I'm new here, right? But I've been making inroads and the whole, real, one of the points of the store itself is it being such a hub and a focal point for the community and being able to engage with just any and everybody. It's like such a wide range of folks that come through here, but within a setting that is like 95% white and a weird mix politically. Like the state of Vermont does have a high percentage of folks that are, left leaning, but I would say more liberal. And I have no illusions about, how problematic liberalism can be. Yeah, I do think, they're just from my ability to engage just thus far. And, and I don't know until I know, and they could be running me out of here with a pitchfork or, who knows, right? But it does really genuinely feel like there is an opportunity to build like old school concepts of working class solidarity and to bring people in and, to be able to communicate with people who think that they're on opposite ends of a political spectrum based on this polarity between Republicans and Democrats in our landscape, and to be able to draw back and have these discussions with people that, we use different words for when we're talking amongst ourselves, but like, let's have the conversation about why it is that in, a store in the middle of rural Vermont, I can't get a gallon of milk delivered from our supply chains in the middle of Vermont. We're surrounded by dairy cows. Why is that? Let's have that conversation, and having those conversations with them with things that they can relate to, that they can get on board with and build that commonality, and then move back from there. And my favorite conversations, always start with fuck Biden. And I'm like, yes, and here's why, right? So, yeah, I hope, right? But that is not to remove the reality that there are just dead ass white supremacist forces that are armed, that are organized, and all of those things that we have to be constantly cognizant of. And even if we think that we're making inroads with, some semblance of working class, solidarity, it'd be good to at least bring some of these folks into maybe a neutral place, right? Like, but we have to be real, like, and we have to be prepared for self-defense, which is something that a lot of folks just don't want to talk about, right? They don't want to talk about the need for actual physical self-defense. But I bring it up all the time because we need to be talking about it.
Yeah, I'm just to jump in quickly on it. I don't individually, right? I don't have confidence in the totality, of course, of the white working class. Obviously, I think there's a critical mass that can be and has been and should be organized. And I think that's a very important concept. But at the same time, I don't want to think anybody think that I have any delusions that the Black working class, right, or other working classes are ready to struggle. I just think the historical oppression gives a better chance at organizing, because at the same time that the white working class, let's say, has been, I don't want to say brought over, because I think the white working class throughout American history has usually broke right. I should have said broke white, actually. Has usually broke right. I think for the most part, that's what has happened. But it doesn't mean at the same time there hasn't always been a critical mass of white resistance to what America is about, a denunciation of white racism and white supremacy. I also say that during this, let's say this 30 or 40 year period, I think part of the historical model is that that Black folks, right, have been picked off, particularly Black leadership. One reason why we had the destruction of Black militant movements in the 60s and 70s, and we were left with civil rights and voting rights campaigns, is because the idea became, particularly amongst the liberal class of the elite faction, was that we could use Black folks to counter the loss of some white working class to a right-wing, let's say, Republican Party or right-wing politics. And I think, so during the same time, I think there's been obviously a bringing over of Black elites who help control the mass Black population. Black elites who tell us that it is better to side with Democrats, it's better to side and get a piece of the pie of America than it is to fight against it, better to vote for the lesser of two evils, tend to suggest that all of these folks are hooked up and working within the capitalist model to win rights for them as a small elite and damn the rest of us. So I think there's a capture not only of so-called Black leadership, but a capture even of sort of what Black movements have looked like, particularly post the destruction. And it's clear, we should be clear to say the destruction of Black radical militant nationalist movements in the 60s and 70s. That again has left us with the type of leadership that only thinks that tying our boat to an international capitalist order is somehow going to win this fight for us. So I think there's struggles all the way around.
Kali?
You know, the I think the answer to that has to come from folks better positioned to answer that. And that would be you and Michelle, right? And some other folks we need to include in this conversation. I agree with you know, both Kamal and what Michelle laid out. You know, I argue that there's a necessity for them to be organized, right? Like that should have happened many hundreds of years over. So that necessity remains. The challenge is, you know, finding and developing, you know, layers of cadre of white folks who are willing to do that work and willing to put in the sacrifice that it's going to take, you know, which will include in some cases, you know, dealing with isolation, right? Kind of social isolation and maybe physical isolation, particularly talking about kind of rural and suburban communities where there may not be anybody who thinks remotely like you around for hours, you know, in a drive, where if they do, they're not going to show their heads much in public, right? So dealing with that, learning to kind of pick certain battles, you know, within those communities, and be willing to kind of, you know, tough it out, you know. But you know, it also, we shouldn't lie to ourselves, you know. And this part is where I do think why we need like a new party, a new cadre formation that's really real and rooted in a long-term strategy, because asking people to make that kind of sacrifice is only going to be served when they know that there'll be layers and layers of other comrades, you know, throughout this empire who will have their back, right? So they may be, you know, personally isolated in terms of geography, but have a larger, you know, home and support base if and when they need resources that they can count on. It's not going to be like a if or a maybe, but you know, if a call is made or a push is made, I know someone will answer that, you know, that call. I know resources can and will be more mobilized because we have determined collectively that, you know, whatever the task or the assignment is important. That's the only thing that's going to get people, you know, and we've seen it already in our work in Cooperation Jackson, trying to, you know, some of the young white kids who work with us or have worked with us in the past, you know, to kind of get them to move to the eastern portion of the state, for instance, right? And that shit is hard. You know, folks are, you know, their lives have been threatened repeatedly. So it's not like it's a joke. You know, but the people, we asking people to really be camped out in these places where we're going to have to win white working class over. We're going to have to build the infrastructure that's going to support folks to be able to do that work and sustain that work. So it's a larger challenge, but I think in terms of, you know, developing that cadre of folks of white folks who are going to go and organize other white people and engage in that struggle. That's a particular piece of the program that we have to develop. But I think why I say this so folks are clear. I come from the school of thought that I have to work, within the positionality of how I'm situated historically. So there's some work that I'm able to do and should do as somebody who's Black, who's male. There's some particular types of work that I need to be involved in, to wage some struggle in the Black community, learn ways, not to perpetuate heteropatriarchy, for instance, how to undo that and struggle with, brothers in my community to look and view some other things. So this type of work cuts in a lot of different ways. It's not just one way. But I do think, just given the dynamics of this empire, to think that we can ignore, quote unquote, the white working class would be an error. But let me say this, and then I'm gonna shut up. The biggest threat, I think, in many respects, is not the white working class. The biggest threat is the white petty bourgeois classes and their kind of fickle alignment with the bourgeoisie. If you look at the most of these, formations, these militias and stuff like that, they're not factory workers. Few of them may be farmers, but folks was flying in for January 6th in their own private jets. They was coming in chartered buses and if you look at most of the folks where they came from, these were folks who had multiple houses, multiple assets, were small business owners. They constitute the historic base of. I want a piece of tea. They constitute the historic base of fascism, as it's been expressed, and it's just petty bourgeois elements. And now they can pay, and they can patronize white working class forces to do a number of different things, and they can and will. The Koch brothers did that pretty masterfully, developing the Tea Party, back in 2008, 2009. So I think we need to examine, this phenomenon in the concrete, and how it's actually moving and who are actually the forces and what their interests are, and how this is playing out. Because if we don't understand that, then we don't understand what is this business of Elon Musk buying Twitter, right? That boy is a fascist, and he's doing that to enable fascists to have control over that network and can control that square. He's doing it for political reasons. The cash, you saw he came up with the cash in basically a week, so cash wasn't the issue. And it's, he know it ain't gonna necessarily make a whole bunch of money. That ain't the point. It's political control that he's after, similar to what that little, move he did by leaving California to go to Texas. So I think we got to identify who the real threats are. As we were talking the other day, we need to stop kind of thinking about fascism as just kind of the bashing of one, of the two duopolies. This is actually there's a faction of the ruling class which needs this, which is supporting it, which is going to drive it, which is going to fund it, and going to get it air. This is not inconsequential. This is the program. This is what this capital needs right now to extend its life. So we need to be clear on that ourselves.
Michelle?
Yeah. I mean, a lot of the things that, Carly was talking about resonated about, working in these spaces, and we talk about organizing, these pockets of these, communities, and how it really can, ask me how, be isolating for folks with, our politics. Like I have one within driving distance of me right now, hardcore comrade, but it is the work that needs to be done, and for folks that can do it and have the ability or the flexibility. I definitely welcome folks into this end of our collective preparations, if you will. But yeah, I don't know. I'm just gonna be quiet.
So, colleague Kamal, when you were talking about the explicit emergence of fascism, and Michelle, you mentioned it too. I'm reminded of Ernest Hemingway in For Whom the Bell Tolls. There's a great line. He says, "There are many who do not know they are fascist yet, but they will when the time comes." And I guess that's really, for me, like what's really at the point of it. I am doing my absolute best to try to assess, like, it's a triage moment almost. Like you come out, I believe in community organizing and I believe in people, right? But what I've had to come to terms with is some of these people are actually fascists, and they may or may not, they may not be goose stepping yet, but they're going to be. And so I don't have time to fool with them. I don't have time to try to find some way to break through them. Maybe somebody else can do that. But what I try to do, regardless of who it is to assess which way are they going to break, right? Can I bring them in to our vision of socialism from the bottom? Can I bring them into a re-indigenization? Can I bring them in to the worldview that we share? And I'm wondering if this is making sense to you. Am I making sense, or does that also feel naive?
I mean, I don't think so. I mean, another quote, George Jackson, fascism is already here, right? So I think we're re-entering a stage where maybe the overtness of the fascism is pressed upon us. But the idea of controlling people, murdering people, imprisoning people to control political space, that's already been here, right? Particularly, again, for the Black community. And again, I think the white working class in particular has always been used as a wedge, and has allowed itself in terms of giving a sort of general agency to be used in that way. The formation of policing is dictated by what working class whites joining the police force, having a job and doing that job, which is protecting private property and controlling populations. Prison guards, who are, again, these are not exclusively one color or whatever like that, but particularly in rural areas where they build the prisons so that those folks can have jobs. And again, like you said, it's not necessarily the most overt of thereof, but the racism that kicks in, that these people deserve it, that these people are here because they're different from us, good, upstanding white folks. That mentality, that supremacist mentality, clearly has always paved the way for both covert and overt fascism to arrive and take up its space. But while in the meantime, again, we as community movement builders have an affiliate group, right? We're an all-Black organization. We have an affiliate group of folks who join with us to organize, who are white, brown, and everything else in between, but who we share politics with. There are other organizations that we work with, and particularly in Atlanta, that we share politics with, that we work with, because we understand that the engine of struggling against capitalism is bigger than any one community. And if we don't necessarily join together to struggle around, to figure out, to create different spaces about how we can fight that fight together, then those forces which are already politicized, will themselves feel isolated, right? So, and again, we work with everybody who identifies themselves as communists, to people who identify themselves as anarchists, to sometimes just good old-fashioned progressives. So if people if people are able to identify, depends on what people are willing to do to struggle against capitalist formation, but they've identified that capitalism is at a place where not only has it always been of danger, but is a particular danger because of what folks talked about earlier, or where we're at in terms of the ecosystem as the geopolitical map is changing, as demographics are changing. There's a lot of people who are realizing, of course, that capitalism is about to, quote unquote, destroy the planet. And the question becomes, can we organize those forces, or do those forces get organized either by the right wing or the moderate liberal Democrats who tell them that we can keep this system, we just got to tinker around the edges, right? And if you work with us, we'll give you some resources now so that you can help us keep everybody else in line so that we can continue to tinker around the system. And so there's a large struggle to take place, that is taking place, that I think we all have to figure out what is our role in that struggle. And again, going back to the network is another way that eventually organizations can as we open up the network at some point, that organizations around the country who have similar ideas can potentially join as another way of a larger formation that's getting together to say, this is how we work together to struggle against capitalism, and how capitalism is about to destroy the larger planet. So I think all of these networks and these coming together of different peoples and different politics have to happen to struggle against a larger monster, let's say a larger beast, which has already figured out how to co-opt people, how to bring people in, what are the buttons that need to be pressed so that we can keep these people in line. Capitalism has done a great job of deciding when it's the time to destroy opposition and when it's the time to buy off opposition, right? We, particularly in the American left, are always too busy fighting amongst ourselves for little droppings from the capitalist plate, or ego fighting, as opposed to working together to try to figure out if our enemy is capitalism, then all the rest of it just doesn't matter, right?
Tully, this comment that this thread that Kamal is on is making me think about some of your calls for true political independence and autonomy. And I'm wondering if you'd be willing to speak to that a little bit. The refrain of COVID, comrade, you're muted.
I said there's different layers of that too. I'm one who's been pushing for a long time that to the extent that folks engage in electoral politics, and I'm not talking about following issues, but involved in that arena of the struggle for power. And it's just one of many, one that I think in our case, too many confused with power, but that's another conversation. But to the extent that we engage in it, I'm one that's been pushing that we need independent political vehicle, one that represents our own interests and not the Democrats or the Republicans. And we need to be very clear and explicit about that in the struggle to wage that. I have never, being a student of history, never been convinced that folks are going to work on the inside of either of those, institutions and reform them from within. And please don't cite anybody. Please don't cite or try to cite the party being won over by the Trump forces as an example of how one might be able to capture one of these instruments. Because I hear some left folks arguing that, and I think it's, again, as Kamal was saying, I don't know what history y'all are drawing from, but those forces have always been in the Republican Party, and they were once firmly situated within the Democratic Party, truth be told. And we have to forget that for the most part, there's been a long-standing gentleman's agreement between, these bourgeois forces about the management of empire. Like there's certain things that they just don't compromise on, or they're just not in contest, right? Like colonizing all of this land. They both agree on that, right? They're not giving up 1 inch of it. There's unanimity amongst them about that. Maintaining, dominance on a global level militarily. They both firmly agree on that. And, they may have some, y'all should kill more people, or, we should do more hearts and mind work. But believe me, that's just tactics. It's not the overall strategy if we're going to be on top. They got agreement on that. And you're not going to change that from operating within, or you're going to wind up putting yourself through some major contortions thinking that you are. Some of the stuff that we see, like some folks coming in, from DSA, and then learning, the limits of what you can push by challenging or even raising, anything about the Israeli military outposts, that the United States holds, right? And let's be clear, that's what that joint is, right? It's a Western military outpost, initially set up by the British and then taken over by their children over here in the United States. And, that's the function that it serves, but to call that in question, you get kind of severely punished real quick within the framework and the apparatus. So there really is no reforming that, just like there really is no reforming capitalism. And I think, to me, the challenge basically is, I understand people's tactics and, things that people might have to do, and compromises in the short term that folks may have to make, kind of local, even some regional level. But, if we can't organize in our own political interests independently, then we are never going to be able to take on the task of transforming the system, right? One should be a minor prerequisite to the other, because transforming the overall the relations of production is going to be a much harder task than just forming a political party that runs in our own name and our own interests. So I think to me, part of it, we need to approach this from here on out as a developmental question, right? And it speaks to, do we think that we could actually win? And by win, let me be clear about what I mean. Win meaning construct a socialist society. If we don't think that we can do that, then all the rest of this is just really exercises in self-indulgence. I think we need to be clear about that and what it's going to take us to get there. So autonomy, political independence, organizing in all interests, these are fundamental things that we got to move on.
Michelle, what's in your head?
All the things. I'm a little fried at this time of night, to be honest with you, and it's Friday. And the little one keeps running up to me. Since we're on the subject, Kali, if you don't talk to them kids tonight, it's gonna be a wrap on my whole situation. So we got to schedule some kid time.
That's on Jai at this point.
It's just constant interruptions. This 7-year-old trying to talk to his kids. But yeah, I just, I generally just, the conference panel, the topic, the session was about, the People's Network for Land and Liberation. And you're just reflecting, especially given my geographic realities at the moment, what an important space it's been for me, personally, and being able to, have thought partners in this process and people who are, like, no, honey, I am not off my meeting.
How much longer, please?
10 minutes.
No, this is 10 minutes last
You see,
time.
Kali, he can't talk to the kids either because he's on his meeting too.
Yeah, but like you said, 10 minutes last
Yeah,
time.
but.
Yeah, but
Jai, go
so-
get the phone. I'll have them. If your mom is on the phone, go get your phone. They can call
There
you
you go.
right now.
Oh, okay.
but you got to go in the other room.
Sorry, y'all.
See, hey, that's some familial and community organizing happening in real time right there.
And it really, it goes back to a comment that Kali had made earlier about the, the work that we're doing right now, like we are not going to see like the culmination or the fruition, of this work. It really, in my mind, this is a long game. Like this is me, putting in the work to the best of my ability, one foot in front of the other for the next generation, right? And yeah, are we, we talk about we want to create a better world. We have to, right? Because this shit is collapsing around us. What we're looking at right now is just not going to be a thing in, this next generation. Like when my kids are my age and they have kids, this, right? So it's not going to be this. What's it going to be? Are we doing the work to try and model right now what could be a viable alternative to folks at large to be able to create the systems in the future that will be able to sustain, not just like survive for this next generation, but can we create the conditions where they might be able to actually thrive? And that's what keeps me going, one foot in front of the other in the meantime.
So our time has flown by. I'm going to invite each of you, Kamal, Kali, and then Michelle for final thoughts.
My final thoughts are only that, we all got into this work, it feels like, because we understood that there were folks who were dominating political, economic, social spaces, and that those folks who were doing that weren't doing that for the benefit of our community, whether or not we saw it firsthand, whether or not we read about it and came to it. It's clear that there are forces who have dominated a certain period of history and wish to continue to do so. And they will do so until they're stopped or until they are destroyed. Most of what we think of as the functional way in which the planet operates, and they only sort of control a slither of it, and then the rest of us are still left to operate at their behest. So capitalism is a beast, and those who run it, who benefit from it, who control it, are not giving up that grand enterprise. And so for me, this is ultimately always a political question, a question of, are we going to fight to bring about what other systems can look like, to fight against those who are trying to oppress us? And it is one particular way that's happening is through this network. And I think there are other forces eventually that we should be joining up with. I believe all our forces are probably relatively small, but there is growth to be had. And there's been time periods in history where we've seen that growth in terms of uprisings, in terms of movement organizing, and we've also seen those things be taken over or swiftly destroyed. So we have to have that long arc that people have been talking about. But lastly, I'll say, even within the work that I particularly am doing, I do this work, and we have younger organizers in their 20s and 30s who are ready to take this work over. And I think so that part of the legacy, I think, is something that we have to make sure that we continue to drive towards, is what is it that we're creating now? What is it we're building on? What is it that we're doing? And so that there's other folks who will be able to work with us, to take over, to keep that fight going. Because that is the fight that's going to be continually happening. There is no end of history for me. There's always going to be struggle. So even when there's some victories, there's always going to be some defeats around the corner, and vice versa. And part of this work that we're doing is around how do we bring together these networks, these opportunities, and build these larger formations, which are going to have a say in how our future looks.
Kali.
I'll say this, as we continue to grow, move, develop, I hope we've outlined enough of a rationale to everyone listening to understand why a network like this is why we're struggling to build it, and that you will give some consideration that when and where we're ready for folks, to join in or to form something similar, within your region, to connect with. Because it's going to be a long process, and it's going to be multi-levels and layers of federation that's going to have to take place. So everything through one entity is not a necessity. But at some point, to move, to transform the relations of production to upend this empire, we're going to have to aggregate our power together. So, hopefully this gave you enough of a taste of where we're going, why we're doing what we're doing, that you might want to link up with at some point in time down the road, and to think about these strategic, questions and the little things that we've offered by way of, debate towards, some resolution of certain social questions or solution to certain social problems, provide some clarity for everyone, to engage in your organizing work locally.
Michelle.
I don't want to be the person to leave the last word. I'm going to leave it right where Kali left it.
Well, I was going to have the last word, so.
Well, that's on you then.
All right, I'll take it on only because I promised Nicola that I would set her up. So it's going to go like this. Networks of networks. One of the things that we have to be clear about is that this is a three-dimensional way of thinking about it. There's not going to be one thing. The People's Network for Land and Liberation does not imagine that it is going to be the formation under which all the other formations run. That is, I want to be crystal clear with everybody that what we're saying is we're trying to unite folks who have a shared political analysis, not only around white supremacy and capitalism, but very clearly that we are revolutionaries, and with all that means. And with that, we make a commitment that we teach as we fight, we learn as we lead. And we invite you into the process with us. If we're making mistakes, we ain't doing it on purpose. Help us see better. Join us in the struggle for clarity, because we in it to win it. Nicola?
Well, thank you so much, David. And thank you to all of our panelists today. This is just such a thought-provoking subject. And for me, as a labor organizer, I just think that these conversations are happening across industries. It doesn't matter where you are or what you're trying to do, the type of change you're trying to actualize. It's like we're all having this conversation, grappling with a lot of the underlying issues that y'all were really thoughtfully talking through today. So I just appreciate you so much for your consideration, your thoughts on this, as well as the hope that y'all are offering us. I mean, this is all about bringing folks together, right? The networks that are growing, the fact that sometimes we are isolated by our respective areas. And so we have to be thinking about how we reach out and connect with people across different spaces. And if this summit is a space to facilitate that, we're so incredibly pleased to be a part of that, because that's how we build the future, right? And I love that there's all these things going on. I'm still popping off, trying to chase my creatures around the house, trying to figure out how to keep all the pieces moving. And so I appreciate your, sharing with us all the things of your lives that you're all bringing together. We have had an amazing couple of days thus far, and we're actually entering into our next panel session coming up around the corner for us, between 5 and 6:30 Pacific time. We're going to be talking about decolonizing restoration. The presentation will be brought forward by Chico TEK and Cal Trout. We have some incredible panelists. They're going to be really talking through a lot of these pieces, and then we'll be finishing tonight with our cultural offering, Good Shield and 7th Generation Rise, bringing us some music for this evening. So thank you all so much for your time, everything that you had to teach us. We're so grateful that you participate in this summit, and we'll see many of you in a couple of moments at our next session.